The wind came thieving through the dead pines and set the needles whispering as if the forest remembered every name it had swallowed. Snow fell without haste, not the heavy, smothering kind, but dry, fine stuff like sifted ash. Ghost moved ahead of John, a pale streak that gathered the light and made of it a living thing. When he vanished, he seemed not to have gone but to have been accepted by the landscape, a permission granted by winter to one of its own. They had followed the trail 2 days. Trampled snow, charred bones in a circle of stones, splinters of a broken spear. A child's belt of bone beads snagged on a branch. Tormund knelt beside it and let out a noise that was not a word. He had buried 4 sons and 3 wives and still carried laughter in him like a blade. But the thieving of children cut differently. Not worse than wolves, he said, though he was not speaking of wolves. Wolves take because they must, John said. These will take again because they are men and they have learned they can. Ghost returned, breath smoke, the snow stinging his nose. The dire wolf pressed his forehead briefly to John's thigh and then veered toward a dark thumb of cliff where the trees thinned. John followed the spoor of man. Iron nail in a boot heel, the deliberate weight of hungry men keeping to the shallow drifts where the wind had scoured. They had moved like men who knew the cold and were unafraid of being seen. That was wrong. Raiders who feared pursuit left no fires. These had burned. At the cliff, the wind rose and the forest fell away like a dropped cloak. The gorge of the milk water cut the land in two, ice-sheathed and indifferently ancient. A rope bridge was strung to the next buttress, black thing on white air, its knots rimed in frost. From beneath, where the sliding river spoke a muffled language in its blue throat, came the complaint of ice against rock. The Bridge of Skulls, the free folk called it, not for what hung from it but for the stories of those cast down. Tormund spat over the edge and watched his spit freeze before it disappeared. They crossed, he said, and none followed. Your crows have no taste for the gorge. They have no numbers, John said, and fewer will wear the black than once did. Tormund looked at him sidelong. But there's one they'd follow if he asked. John let the cold work its way under his jaw, through his hair, into the bone. He had come north to be no one, to be a man among the people who did not ask his name. He had hoped the quiet would fill him and leave no room for the other things. It had not. The free folk were free, but freedom had made of some a creed and of others an appetite. And south of the wall there were thousands who knew hunger and would soon know fear besides. They were all the same people. If the dark came again or the earth shook or a man with a pile of coin decided his horse needed feeding more than a child did. The wall had stood against a single shape of night. None had taught it to stand against men. This way, he said, and as he tied back his hood and set his hand to the rope, the first sharp note of a horn came thin through the cold air from beyond the bridge. They crossed on hands and feet, rope shivering, the wood bites bright where the frost had sickled them, the gorge's breath rising. Ghost moved lightly, as if the air bore him up. On the far side, the horn sounded again and John counted, long, short, long. A free folk signal, not the watches. It took a moment to find the source. A woman with hair the color of brushed iron, standing at the edge of a stump-blank meadow, waving what had been a white cloth and was now the color of snow stepped upon. Crows, she called, and then, when Ghost came into view and her eyes widened, no, wolf, snow, Sigrin, Tormund said, relief cutting through his voice like brandy. I thought you dead or slaved. I am neither, she said. Not today. Her hand shook as she lowered the cloth. They came at dusk 3 nights past. They took the old, the limping, the ones who couldn't fight or were too weak to run. They had iron collars. They spoke like Southerners and wore scraps of 3 kinds of livery, as if any meant anything to them. They laughed at the trees. I killed one, but his friends took my daughter for the price. Her eyes, which had been the dull iron of winter, brightened briefly with a terrible life. They went toward the wall. They left tracks enough for a blind man. Bandits, John said. Broken men and worse, fattening themselves on the road. The gift draws them like fat draws flies. There's timber there, and sheep, and villages with no lord near enough to keep watch. They'll sell who they can sell and feed who they can feed, and burn what doesn't fit into their mouths. Sigrin's jaw clenched until the muscles stood out like cords. Will you go after them? Jon did not say yes. He took Sigrin's forearm. The skin beneath his glove was cold and hard as horn. You'll take your people into the pines and you'll keep to the ravines until you cross into the shadow of the wall. Go to Castle Black. What waits at Castle Black? She asked, as if he told her to go to the house of a dead man. Fire, Jon said, and meat if there is any. Men who will stand between you and those who'd take from you. Tormund laughed and slapped Jon's shoulder so hard the blow jolted him. Hear that? The wolf remembers he has a voice. I remember that there's too much silence, Jon said, and that if we wait for crows to make numbers, there'll be only bones left to keep them company. Sigrin looked at him as if assessing the truth in him were a thing she could cut open and count. Bring my daughter back, she said flatly, or bring me something of hers that I can put in the ground. They built a signal fire on the cliff's lip and left it smoldering so that Sigrin's people, brave enough to move under smoke, could see. Then they moved south in a lean, looping arc that picked you. P-men like a hook, a thin boy with a missing ear, a woman with a baby and a pack twice her size, 2 young men from a village in the New Gift who had gotten used to pushing cattle toward the woods whenever strangers appeared on the old road. One of the young men wore a leather cap with a broken cockade. Black Oath, he said when Jon glanced at it, and he showed his throat where the old Vauskar was pale. I kept it as I could. It was no one's fault, there was no one left to say the words to. He had been a boy of 15 when he took the blacks and a man of 17 when they told him to go home. He had not gone home. He had come to the wall and found empty rooms and an old dog with one eye who would not leave the kitchens. By the time they sighted Castle Black across the snowplain, the light had softened to that evening color that makes the world look thin as vellum. Wood smoke rose from 2 chimneys instead of 1. That was new. Jon felt the tightness in him ease and return again like a tide. He had come north to vanish. He was about to do the opposite. Are you so set on this? Tormund asked as they came within sight of the gate. If you call them, they will come. If you call them, you cannot unsay it. Nothing I have ever said has stayed said, Jon said, and then, because Tormund had earned more than riddles, I am tired of burying. I am tired of telling the living they must live quietly so the dead can sleep. The old oath was for a world that is gone. It held because the dark was simple. The dark is not simple any longer. The man on the gate, one arm in a sling and a hat of rabbit fur that sat badly on his head, leaned out and stared for a long heartbeat as if his eyes were bad. Then he shouted, "The Lord Snow! Gods, where have you been?" "North," Jon said, when the gate creaked open on its stiff hinges. "And south, and unsure of my own boots." They built fires and crowded the hall with bodies and steam and meat smell. It was not much of a hall, not anymore. The long tables had been cut into lengths to feed the stoves during the last long winter when no wagons came. Beneath his palm, the grain told the history of the tree. Straight winters, crooked summers. The cook was a boy who could barely see over the pot but knew the taste of salt and onion and the sound soup makes when it is thinking. Jon broke bread with Tormund, with Sigrin's boy, with the 2 former black brothers who had remained because the place needed men who knew how the walls settled at night, how the tunnels breathed, how the fittings complained if bolts were over-tightened. He stood when the pot had been scraped clean and men had licked bowls for the pride of it, and set his hand on the back of the old chair that had held the weight of men who had believed they need never look south. "When I took an oath in this hall," he said, "the world was as it had been for thousands of years. There was a line drawn across the land and the business of one side was not the business of the other. We discovered that was a lie. We discovered that if we tend to only one side of the dark, the other comes in through the cracks we don't watch. There are those in the woods who will not cut the throats of children if they are given another way to feed their own. There are those in the south who will feed their horses while children starve. If I am to give my life away, I will give it to anyone who is cold and afraid and does not know if morning will come. I ask this, then, not obedience, not blind eyes turned to bargains that make men rich while others freeze beside the road. I ask for a new watch. I ask that those who will stand in the places where harm comes from and make harm pay a price for crossing. We will not belong to any lord. We will not take part in quarrels over chairs and rings. We will grieve for any dead child, and we will not ask whose flag its father carried. If you will stand thus, stand with me. There was a quiet after that, the particular silence of men trying not to look at one another. Then the boy with the missing ear stood. He wasn't much to look at, except his eyes, which had that starved seriousness that has nothing to do with food. I will, he said, and his voice surprised even him. Sigrun's son put his hand on the boy's shoulder. Tormund grunted. A new watch, he said, rolling the words in his mouth like ale he wasn't sure of. Call it what you will. We will call ourselves who we are. And if any man thinks to make a chain of it, he'll learn iron bites cold. It began with 36 of them. They slept in rooms that had once held 10 times that number, and their breath at night rose in a honeycomb of white that hung beneath the rafters. They made new fires and scoured soot from stone with snow and stubbornness. Jon wrote till his fingers cramped, to Winterfell, whose doors he had left and whose halls were still the hall of his childhood. To the king in the City of Smoke where the river split and bridged itself. To the Manderleys at White Harbor, who had boats and stubborn pride and memories of wolves stretched further back than most southern houses. To those mountain clans that had not forgotten how to look a storm in the teeth and smile back. He did not sign with anything but his name. He did not ask as if bowing his head. He spoke of children taken and old men beaten on the road and caravans of free folk who had learned they could trade hides for iron and had learned, too, that not every man who wears wool wears good intentions. He sent the letters with ravens that had not flown far in years. The birds wheeled and cursed and vanished into weather, and Jon felt the old watcher in him sit up and fret. Waiting was a younger man's misery, and he had been young so long he had mistaken that for something permanent. Ghost curled near the door and watched the room with the perfect patience of a creature who had never spoken a human word and did not wish to. The first reply came riding, not flying. Was a woman wrapped in a gray doublet trimmed in fox, with hair the color of oak bark and a scar on her cheek that made her beauty a thing you could trip on. She dismounted in the yard with the kind of grace that meant she was not thinking about how she looked. Your Grace, she said, and smiled when he grimaced. Forgive me, I have been told not to call you that. So, Jon Snow if you prefer. My lady bids me bring meat and men, provided your men refrain from peering at the Lady of Winterfell as if she had grown 3 heads since last you saw her. Sansa, Jon said, and the word was iron and sun all at once in his mouth. He took the letter from the woman and did not trust himself to read it in the yard. He read it in the hall where the table edges showed axe bites and the benches were minted in 3 different sizes from 3 different centuries. The letter smelled faintly of beeswax and lavender, and the script had that stern neatness Sansa had learned from Maester Luwin and then sharpened with the world. He heard her voice as he read. Jon, the North does not wish to see smoke from her lands rise again. If what you propose keeps smoke low to the ground and under kitchens, not on roofs, I will give it my name. I will not tolerate a second army in competition with mine. I will welcome a shield that looks outward with rules that bind it. Come to Winterfell, bring your wolf and bring the truth, and let us write a thing together that our dead will not be ashamed of. He brought 40 men to Winterfell and a woman whose boy had been taken and whose hands wore their nails like knives, and a cook who put garlic in everything, and a spearswoman who had once traded kisses for iron and who now traded iron for safety. Winterfell did not seem smaller. It seemed too proud to remember how to feel shame at its own size. It had a new banner on one tower and the old on the rest, and smoke rose from every chimney like the breath of a sleeping beast. The snow had been cleared from the yard and piled in careful heaps, flanked by straw to keep it from encrusting. The doors stood open, though the cold bit hard enough to make the hairs inside Jon's nose crisp with breath. Sansa embraced him in the yard. Not a queen's gesture, not that day. Her hair was braided back and pinned simply, and the furs on her shoulders were dark and thick. You look like a man who has been outside too long, she said, her smile brief but true. That may be the case, he said. You look like Winterfell. I had meant to look like steel, Sansa said. "But I will take it." They ate in the great hall, with the new banners and the old, and after the plates had been cleared and the room tilted into quiet, Sansa rose and spoke the practicalities in a voice that carried. She spoke of the new gift and the people scattered thinly across it like seed after a poor sowing. She spoke of villages in the crook of rivers and on the edges of forgotten Roman roads, of the stone houses that had fallen 40 years since and had become pig shelters, of the walls that could be repaired with little if many hands worked at once. She spoke of the watch Jon proposed and the rules it would need. No taking of lands or wives without leave. No sitting in lordly councils to decide taxation and its cousins. No bearing of a single lord's sigil. She spoke of tithes paid in kind by those protected. If your sheep are not stolen this winter, you owe this: 3 fleeces, a cord of wood, a sack of oats, a day's work on the road. She proposed that the new watch, for that is what she called it, and Jon felt both a sting and a balm in the word, should recruit not only from orphans and criminals and surplus sons but from any who wished to swear to service beyond any one house. She proposed that women be received if they wished it and could bear the weight of it, and that their oaths bind as tightly. She proposed, and the hall held its breath and did not break, that crimes against those under the new watch's protection be judged at Winterfell with someone wearing the new black seated beside the old lords. "You will need money," one of the Karstark men said. "You have timber," Sansa answered, "and men with hands. Build roads and charge a reasonable toll. Guard the roads. Keep the tolls low. If any man tries to raise them high enough to make a fortune, cut off his hand and hang it beside the road to remind him of what he tried to pick. If you do it cleanly, the king will forgive us our northern ways." The room made a low sound. Amusement and approval mingled. Sansa did not smile. "If you stand outside the quarrels of those who sit in rooms with tapestries and wine and argue about which cousin sits where, if you bring a man's daughter home to him no matter whose daughter she is and no matter what else the man has done, men will feed you. And if they do not, I will." Then, quieter, to Jon alone as the voices in the hall rose, "I do not want to, but I will." "Thank you," he said, and the words were small for what he felt and had to be enough. Sansa invited him to her solar after, and he tracked years into that room. The girl who had wanted lemon cakes and songs. The woman who had learned the price of songs. She poured wine and did not drink, and when she spoke it was with the gentleness she used only when she wanted to know if the person across from her would break. "Will you be able to stand aside if some lord's banners insult you?" she asked. "If some man says your mother's name ill, though he is wrong about the name and wrong about the blood? Can you ignore those small wars and keep watch for the larger one?" "I have ignored worse," Jon said. "I know," Sansa said, "and I will not make a saint of you for it. You did what you thought right and put your head on a pillow you hated to see if you could sleep. I would see you sleep, Jon. I am not a fool. I see what wakes you." She set the cup down. "I am asking you to wear a chain of a different kind. Not a king's chain. My hand will not hold the end of it." He looked at her and thought how strange the roads are that carry us between what we thought we wanted and what we can bear. "I will take it," he said. "Not because you ask me to, because it is the only thing I know to do that has any weight that doesn't crush more than it carries." Sansa nodded once, as if she had expected nothing else for the past 3 years, and had only needed him to speak it so the air around them knew it, too. "Good," she said. "Then there is a thing I would show you, and I will forgive you for not smiling when you see it." In the gods would the snow fell in fattening flakes that seemed to whisper as they landed, as if the trees were shushing the world. The heart tree's face was as it had been when Jon was a boy, when the grooves had seemed fresh as blood. It was older now than any man and had seen younger grief than either of theirs. Beside it stood an old iron ring that had been cleaned and oiled. Beside the ring lay a sword Jon knew too well. "I had it brought back," Sansa said as he knelt. "It did not belong in that place of knives and whispers. It belongs here until it needs to be carried, and I think it needs carrying now." He lifted the blade, and for a moment the memory of fire gripped his throat. He did not pull away when it came. He let it wash him and recede, as water does when it learns a man will not drown for its convenience. He set the flat of the blade against the iron ring. "Every oath needs a weight," he said. We will swear our new one here. We, Sansa said, one eyebrow rising. We, Jon said, will swear to each other. You will swear to let us do our work, and we will swear not to become what we hate. The first swearing took place in the Night Fort. Sansa rode north with them, and the men of the New Watch who had been boys once and had grown into their hunger and learned to leash it, and the women whose knives did not tremble when they bit into wood for cooking. The Night Fort was a cold mouth in the side of the world. Its gatehouse was a mouth and its tunnels were a throat. The shivering, maddening sound of wind through old arrow slits made men think of voices speaking through trees. Jon had dreamed of the weirwood gate under the ground there. The pale face shaped by a craftsman who had never seen a face and had listened to trees to learn what they looked like. The first time he had passed it, he had felt like a ghost. This time he came as a man. There were no others in the world now, but there were other old things. The gate was one of them. Jon pressed his hand to the wood, and it was as warm as skin left in sunlight. He did not speak the old words, the exact syllables that had been whispered into his ear as a boy in cold air. He did not think the gate needed recitations as much as it needed to hear hearts. I have killed for peace that did not come, Jon said softly. I have lain with the idea that death would buy us a coin of quiet. It bought us a breath and a debt. I cannot pay that debt by killing more. I can only pay it by being what I failed to be. Will you open for me if I do so? The wood sighed, an old thing remembering the sound of summer rain. Snow fell through the hole in the roof in slow thickening flakes. Sansa stood beside him and did not speak, and that was her gift. Ghost pressed his nose to the wood where Jon's hand had been, and the gate shivered open, not wide but enough for a person to pass into the earth and out again without crying out. They said the new words there, each of them, not a long vow. It spoke of roads and fires, of the duty to bring children home and make raiders pay honest wages for wood or else swing for theft. It spoke of taking no coin from a single lord large enough to buy the whole of a man's attention. It spoke of laying down any grievance at the edge of the Watch Road and leaving it there. It spoke of standing at fords in flood and on fences during feuds and making both sides look at the shoes they wore and remember how they had bought them. It spoke, above all, of mercy with teeth. When they finished, the silence in the Night Fort was not the same as the one that had greeted them. It had weight now and eye white in it, a listening. Sansa put her fingers on Jon's wrist and squeezed once, hard enough to leave the memory of her grip in the skin. Now you have a thing you can offer to the world and not feel like a beggar doing it, she said. Now you can write to the king. The king's reply came sealed with a wax that smelled faintly of resin and smoke and whatever perfumes the South felt it needed to keep its scent above human air. Jon read the words by the light of seal-fat lamps. He saw Bran's hand in them, precise, a little far away, careful not to overstep another sovereign's toe when that toe was his sister's. He acknowledged the Watch's new vow and the old gift upon which it stood. He promised protection of law and asked for a thing in return. Report. Let me know what you see. Let me know when the river spits bones or when the road grows teeth. Let the Watch be eyes as well as arms. And at the end, a line that was not the king speaking but the boy who had fallen and learned to fly on roots and ravens. Thank you for living. Jon folded the parchment as if it were a bird and set it aside. He looked at Sigrin. We go at dawn, he said. They went after the raiders not with fury but with arithmetic. Fury fed men and then left them cold, sicker than they had been before they ate. Arithmetic took its time. They learned the bandits' habits. They avoided the old forts but camped near ruins for the shelter of fallen stones. They burned green wood, which made more smoke. They slept in a circle as soldiers do who have learned to trust watchmen, and they set their watchmen in pairs to keep them honest. Jon sent the boy with the missing ear ahead of them to listen at night as children do, being small and choosing those places where snow knots into hollows and catches sound when men wish to keep it. He sent Sigrin's son and the spearswoman to the farmers near Queenscrown to ask quietly for help. He sent a message to White Harbor asking for men used to rope, used to marsh, used to getting across water that tricked the feet. They caught the raiders at Queenscrown 2 days shy of the new moon. The tower hunched on its little island, ringed by wet dark stones. In the thaw, the place is a trap for boys who fancy themselves hunters. In winter, it is a place for careful men to die if they mistake a crust for a bridge. The iron collars had been left on a sledge, stacked like loaves. That was a kind of blasphemy Jon did not forgive. The women the raiders had taken were in a stable that leaned at an angle and creaked when the wind touched it. Tormund took out the first sentry with a stone, as if they were boys in a training yard and not hard men in the pages of a story no one had chosen to be in. Jon crossed the causeway first and felt the ice shift under his foot and did not sink. Ghost went beside him, his ears pricked, the sound of his breath small and steady. The boy with the missing ear crawled along the edge of the marsh, where the brown water showed itself like an old scar through the snow, and cut the raiders' lead ropes. When the raiders ran to catch their horses, the horses had no wish to be caught by them. Horses know things about men that men do not. When the alarm went up, it was like a flock lifting all at once. Noise is noise, but the new watch's noise had a shape to it, and after the first clash and the first blood, other shapes revealed themselves. The men from White Harbor, who had come on sleds along the river ice, were where the raiders had thought no men could be. The spearswoman took a man by the knee as he ran and left him to consider the rest of his life with one leg shorter. Sigrin's son found the stable and cut the rope on the door in 2 strokes and brought the women out one by one, shielding them with his back as if the world were a rainstorm and he had grown very wide. Jon caught the leader near the sledge because that was where a leader would be if profit were the point, guarding the coin. He had a good sword, that man, and it had been sharpened that morning by someone who knew steel. They traded 3 blows, and on the 4th Jon stepped in close and turned the sword with his offhand and put the pommel of his own into the man's mouth. Teeth broke. The man fell. Jon's boot met his throat. "Who pays you?" he asked. "You think I need paying?" The man coughed. Jon pressed harder and felt the noise suffocate. "A lord," the man said then quickly. "A little one. Says his name like it's bigger, like a rooster. He gets a cut. He gets any girl he wants." "Who?" Jon said, and when the man laughed bloodily, he let a little truth into the man's windpipe to show he knew how to take more. The man said the name as if he had been waiting to spit it. Jon did not know it. That was good. He would not be unmade by old hatred. When it was finished, there were 2 of Jon's men dead and 6 of the raiders, and the stable had stopped creaking and lay still. They burned the iron collars in a heap, and the smell made Jon step away. Not because it was rank, but because it was honest. There are some things a man should not teach his nose to bear. Sigrin found her daughter's hair ribbon in a muck pile and held it as if the ribbon could make a child out of air. "She was here," she said, and her voice didn't break. "They moved her on. South." "Then south it is," Tormund said. "I have always wanted to see what lies down that way besides bad wine and worse manners." They followed winter roads that had once been the pride of the old king's masons and were now the pride of no one in particular. They did not march under a banner. But word moves faster than even banners in a country that has learned to gossip for survival, and people began to step out of houses and stand beside fences to watch them pass and make that sound when breath freezes and cracks. At Barrowton they found the Lord Sigrin's daughter had been sold to, and they found his ledger. It was neat, the ledger. It recorded in a hand a girl's name and a sum and the destination. It recorded the house's name as if that were a shield big enough to hide under. Jon took the ledger. He took the Lord, too, and did not hang him. He marched him to Winterfell and put him on his knees before Sansa and told him to read the names in his ledger aloud. The hall did not shout. It made a low noise that men make when they hear the black dog inside them breathe. Sansa did what a queen should do. She took his lands while leaving his family a house to sleep in and a roof that did not leak and a hearth that smoked only when you set wet wood on it. She gave the lands to the Watch, not to farm but to use. Pasture for horses, timber rights, a ford that could be held if the river rose like a beast out of the bed. "If you were a southern queen," Tormund said, watching the man go pale with the knowledge of what it means not to own, "you would have made a show of his neck and a rope." "I have need of his grain," Sansa said. "Men hang too easily when there is nothing else a woman can do. The first act of the Watch that will outlast us will not be a rope. Not today." They found Sigrin's daughter in a brothel less reputable than a latrine, in a room with a bed that shifted when a wagons passed outside. The girl had learned to shrink without moving. Sigrin went inside as if there were no air between her and the door and came out with her daughter walking. John thought then of all the old stories of men bending knees and wars settling with a blade slid between ribs, and he thought, if men must be made to fear, let us teach them to fear the eyes of a mother who has come to take what is hers. News of the new watch ran ahead of them. It ran faster and farther whenever they chose not to behead a man who would have looked good-wit. His head in his hands. It ran fastest when they left food and took only a promise of work in spring. They failed sometimes. It was not a story without failures. A caravan disappeared along the Bay of Seals and was never found. A free folk village burned because a man decided not to believe that the rules applied to him if no one was looking. There were nights when John lay awake with ghosts' warmth a little way off and counted the ways a man could fail. He wrote to the king so often that the ravens began to sound impatient when they saw him. He wrote to Sam at the Citadel, who wrote back with ink-splattered pages about the history of oaths given at boundaries and old songs about rivermen who bound themselves to ferry anyone over for a coin, king and beggar alike. Sanson, one of the mountain men who could not be convinced to speak softly even to his own shadow, came to John one night as if he had been awake for 30 years and had decided to still his heart by speaking. "You're making crows who are not crows," he said. "But the dark doesn't care what name you give your fires. A tooth is a tooth." He tapped his chest. "Make sure the teeth you give to others aren't the ones that will bite you later." "I am trying," John said, and the admission hung like frost. "I am trying to make a thing that even when it fails leaves the air a little better than it found it." Hardhome called to him. He did not hear it with his ears. The letter from White Harbor spoke of a fisher village on the edge of the bay that saw odd lights at night like will-o'-the-wisps, and heard rocks singing when the tide fell back. There had been a time when ships had gone to Hardhome to look for survivors and had returned with men who never could tolerate music again, because it made them think of the sound the wind makes when it wants you to walk into the sea. That time was past. But the sea keeps what is thrown into it, and sometimes it remembers the shape of the thing and offers it up again wrong. He went because a watch that only stands where it is comfortable is no watch at all. They took a Manderley cutter with ribs strong and sails patched but honest. John's sea legs were the same as everyone's who had never learned to love the water. They were clumsy, and he made offerings to the gods by leaning over the rail. Ghost hated the boat as if it were a rival. He paced and looked at John with disgust. When they were far enough east that the shore became the idea of a line instead of a line itself, the sea changed color to a blue that made the heart quiet the way a blade across a throat quiets the body. Sometimes ice formed on the bow in lace that looked like a queen's collar. Sometimes the water went oil black and showed them their faces in a way no mirror has the courage to do. They found Hardhome unforgiven by the world and sharper than a tooth. The cliffs were taller than memory, and the gulls that lived there had the eyes of judges. They found men and women holed up in caves above the old shingled beach, and John knew them by their silence before he knew them by their speech. Silence does not always mean grief, and it does not always mean peace. Sometimes it is the only clothing left. They brought those who would go food and blankets and a way out. They burnt a ring of blackened driftwood the size of a hall and slept inside it, because old fears behave better when you make the rules of a place. 3 children were missing from the caves, taken by men with ropes who had come in a boat with no colors and oars wrapped in cloth to quiet them. They had left footprints shaped like southern boots. There is always someone ready to make trade out of ruin. John said, "Then we go south once more." And the men from White Harbor grunted and said they had thought they had signed up to fish, not to chase ghosts, and then made ready to row. Tormund spat into the sea and told it to give the children back. The sea ignored him, which put them on even terms. They found the slavers in a small cove where the cliff drops to flat and the wind made little winters whenever it changed its mind. The men did not think of themselves as slavers. They thought of themselves as men in a bad season. John listened to them explain as they knelt on the ice and looked up at the sky because that was easier than looking at him. He could feel his shame breathing behind him. He did not cut their throats. He did not enslave them to teach them a lesson about chains. He put iron on their wrists and rode them south and made them build a bridge over a little river that had taken 3 children the spring before. He made them haul the rocks until their backs were leather and their palms were glass. When they had finished, Sigrin's daughter cut the ropes on their wrists. "If you sell another child," she said, as if reciting a recipe, "we will find you and we will bring you a piece of what you sold. Only a piece." She said it without heat. They believed her. The new watch grew not because there was food or glory in it, but because there were men and women who had tried the other way and found it too small for their grief. They came from the Neck and from Rills and from the little villages along the King's Road, where the road enters the north and decides whether to be brave about snow. A woman from the Vale came with a falcon on her wrist and the air of someone who had come in the wrong door and was content to stay anyway. She taught them to see from the sky and to tell a man by the way he held a shovel. A boy from Skagos came with a knife longer than his arm and a laugh that sounded like something you hear at night and aren't sure whether to be afraid of. He learned that the laugh was better used to scatter a crowd than a knife was to make quiet in it. They came, and they learned the weight and the balance of the new vow, and they learned how to move in a fight like water that remembers its shape after you put your hand into it and take it away. They learned, too, when to put down swords and pick up shovels, and when to say no to a lord who thought he had hired the watch to be his loud hounds. There were those who hated them for it. It is dangerous to look like justice to men who have grown fat on their own accounting. A lord in the Barrows sent a letter to Sansa that called them vagabonds in neat black. He raised a levy to reclaim the tolls on a road he had let rot for a decade. He crept at night to the gorge with men who thought their boots made them invisible because the boots had cost so much. He meant to cut the rope bridge and let the free folk starve in their cold, to prove to the world that the new watch was a story and not a structure. Jon learned of it because men talk, and because the Manderleys always know when a boat sets off if that boat has a bill of sale, and because when you feed a man's children he brings you things that are useful without knowing that's what he's doing. The night they came to the gorge was a night that looked like a glass held to a candle, all the stars shaved thin by cold. The wind had fallen properly for once, and snow lay smooth on the flats between the last line of trees and the first line of cliffs. The men who came to cut the bridge wore facecloths to keep their beards from freezing and their thoughts from blowing away. They moved with care and no grace. Jon and the watch moved with the grace one can learn only by walking the same path 100 times at different hours and in different moods. They had no horn call for this. They cut the first pair of men at the anchors and took the second pair without cutting. The Lord himself was at the far anchor, because he was not entirely a coward. He had his hands on the rope with a blade already chewing the fibers. The blade had a boy's toy prettiness to it. Jon stepped into him from the wind side and grabbed his wrist with both hands and felt the old surprise. That a man's strength could be turned aside like a charge into a bog. The blade fell. The Lord fell to his knees. Jon did not like the idea of him kneeling there, as if he were in a story where kneeling would make him a better man. "You can stand up," Jon said, not unkindly. "If you cut this bridge, you will have killed more men with one stroke than you ever meant to kill. You will have started a war that will not look like a war. It will look like a winter. They are raiders," the man said, and Jon heard in his voice that he half believed it, because lies told long enough to others grow cozy when you try them on yourself. "They will come and take our meat and our women, and you will say we must be kind to them because the gods are watching." Jon leaned, not close but close enough that the man could smell the honest salt and leather of him. "I have killed raiders," he said. "I will kill more if I have to, but the women are not meat, and the meat is not yours to burn for a story." Behind him Tormund laughed softly. The laugh was a promise. Men put down their knives when they heard it, because far-off laughter that sounded like a mountain rolling was a thing their grandfathers had been afraid of even when no mountain had ever moved. They bound the Lord and took him to Winterfell and did not present him like a trophy but like a truth. Sansa listened because that is what she does before she decides. She called a council like a winter storm that people could see coming and could only shelter from. The hall filled with men who thought their ancestors' bones gave them standing to speak, and with women who knew their cows' names and their husbands' flaws and thought that gave them more standing than bones. There were words like rope and words like knives. Sansa let them be said. Then she said, "The new watch is not a suggestion. It is not a fashion. It is a wall for the places where walls would be foolish. If you will not pay their tolls, do not use their roads. If you do not use their roads, see how your grain gets to market through drifts higher than your pride. She looked at the lord they had bound and set free again. You will give the watch the rope you meant to cut, and you will give them a bolt of good linen, and you will give... She named a number of simple, enduring things. A new cart wheel, a barrel of iron nails. The bridge will stand. The children will eat. After, in the quiet that reasserts itself when people have gone home to lay their heads in their own monsters' laps. Sansa looked at Jon as if to ask him a question she already knew, and Jon answered it anyway. If you had not stood with us, the watch would be dead by spring. If I had not stood with you, Sansa said, the north would be smaller by spring. She touched the back of his hand once with 2 fingers as if counting pulse. I do not tell you enough that I am proud of you. I do not tell you at all. Consider it said now, and do not look like that. I will not say it again for a year. He laughed, and the sound felt like something being forged rather than broken. He wrote to the king again that night. He wrote of bridges and ledgers and a barrow's lord, and how a new promise had made old ones sit up straighter. He did not write about the nights when he woke with a hand on his chest and no hand there, or about the way he had learned to count mistakes as if they were coins and to put them aside for the times he would need to spend them. The new watch spread along the wall and out into the gift like moss finding water. They built wayhouses, a roof and a hearth and a place to sit your pack. And they took the names of those who came and they kept them so that anyone who needed to find anyone could. They planted trees where there had been none, because a place with no wood is a place where men do stupid things with fire. They put up signposts that said not only how far it was to Winterfell but how far it was to a pot of stew if a man could pay a penny or a story. They sent pairs of watchmen out before every storm to walk the roads and listen, because sometimes the difference between a name read over a grave and a name shouted down a wind is the length of a rope and a man who had his ear to the ground at the right time. Jon learned the feeling of the watch at his back and the feeling of no weight on his head. He learned to send men into fights he did not want to send them into, and learned that if he always went himself, he made the watch smaller by making it depend on the way his foot fell and the way his wrist turned. He took joy quiet as kindling in things that had nothing to do with swords. A child's laugh in a wayhouse, the particular note a kettle makes when snow goes into it and decides to be water again. The day Ghost decided boats were not his enemy and stepped onto one and settled his massive head on the rail like a man who has made peace with a neighbor he despises for the sake of a child. There were winters inside the winter. One of his men, Lyle of the 3 Hills, went mad in a blizzard and had to be tied to a post and sung to like a boy. A woman from the Vale took an arrow meant for someone else and died smiling, as if the world had finally been arranged to her liking. Sigrin's daughter had a daughter. They named the little girl Rowan for the tree in front of the wayhouse where she was born that bent under snow like a woman with a heavy basket and did not break. There were summers inside the winter, too. A day in early thaw when the crows in the trees sounded like a great noisy council of lesser lords and cooked into a stew tasted better than any southern dish with expensive spice. A night when the northern lights walked like tall women across the sky and even Tormund sat quiet. A time Jon stood alone at the top of the wall as the first melt took hold and watched water slide like glass over ice and thought that he could feel in his bones the old shape of the world that had become this new one. He thought then what men do not often let themselves think because it does not pay. That he was, in that moment, happy. Sam came to see them once, robed and owlish and softly smelling of parchment. Jon did not call him Maester, because titles were for men who needed the walls that titles built. They stood by the black gate and Sam reached out and touched the wood and smiled with all his face. And Jon thought, here is a man who loves the world so much he forgives it. I have written a thing about you, Sam said, eyes apologetic. I do not name you, others do, but your watch. I have written of what it means to bind yourself to anyone instead of to someone. It is old and it is new. It is what the first men did when they came to the children and asked to drink from their water. They thought they were strong when they were really simply brave. It is not the same thing. Brave is for an hour. Strong is for years. You have chosen the other. I did not choose it, Jon said, and then, because he had learned to be honest to those who gave him the gift of their honesty. I did. I did not know it, and I did. Sam put his hand on Jon's shoulder and squeezed, as if he were checking his friend for solidity. When you are old, You need stories like this to keep your bones warm, he said. Do not laugh. The world is a cruel stove. We must tend it. Late that spring, when the last rivers remarked upon their banks and returned to their duties, a watcher on the wall saw a band of men and women coming from the south, walking as if they had set down something heavy. They wore no sigils. Some had small bundles. Some pushed little carts with wheels they had greased with a mixture of tallow and hope. They did not look up when the watcher shouted. They kept walking until they reached a wayhouse at the edge of the gift and knocked upon the door. What do you want? The watchman inside called, because rules are rules and you do not invite a stranger into your house without knowing if you are making space for a friend or a problem. A place to stand, the man said, and his voice sounded like he had not spoken to a door in some time. We are from the Trident. We are not welcome at home. The Lord there likes his taxes more than he likes our children. The watchman opened the door. John came there later and the man told him, I let them in because the woman had a bruise on her face that looked like a hand. I have a hand. I made mine do something else with the world that night. They gave the Trident folk plots near a creek that had more fish than sense and a stand of trees that needed thinning and a road that needed a watchman at night. They taught them the rules and the reasons. They asked them if they would stand if others came asking for the same. The Trident folk said yes with the caveat men always give when they mean it. We will if we can. You will, John said. Not because I say to, because your lives will be bigger if you do. He found himself, one evening when the light was blue enough to stain a man's fingers and the sound of far-off chopping carried like a drumbeat, standing at the Bridge of Skulls alone. He did not mean to be alone. He had walked to clear his head and had put down his thoughts on the snow like stones for a path, and when he looked back the stones had sunk. He thought then of the day he had crossed the bridge the first time, a boy balanced in the middle of a blade with one end the south and one end the north, and then of the day he had crossed the other way, with a woman's laughter and sorrow in his blood and the certainty that he had made a choice he could not defend to anyone who loved him. He thought of the day he had taken the old vow and the day he had spoken the new. He thought of the nights he had woken thinking he had a king's weight on him and had found only a blanket and a wolf. He felt the wind and realized it was not as cold as it had been. That did not mean spring had come. It meant only that winter, like all honest things, had grown tired of showing off. Ghost came and put his great head beneath John's hawn. And stared with him into the gorge. We have done this, John said, his voice barely more than breath. We have made a thing. It is not perfect. It is not strong enough to break everything that comes at it. But it stands. Ghost did not answer because wolves do not care for declarations. He leaned into John's leg until John laughed and nearly went to his knees. The sound spread out over the gorge and did not come back to him. It was swallowed, not hungrily but with the politeness of a place that has learned, at last, not to shout all it hears. A raven dropped out of the air and lit on the rope, head cocked. It had a bit of parchment tied to its leg. John worked the knot with fingers that had been cut and burned and made clumsy by useless acts of generosity, and the parchment came away. He read the words and felt something in him settle, not as a man settles in a chair but as ice settles on a branch, new and clean. It was a note from a village halfway to Deepwood Motte, written in an unlovely hand by a woman who had never thought to write anything to anyone in her life. It said, "The men who used to come for our girls do not come anymore. The road has people on it now. The watch comes by once a week and eats with us and takes wood for their fires and leaves money. My son says he wants to wear black. I told him to wait a year. He will not wait. I am angry at you for that and I am grateful. If the gods were men I'd send them a letter like this. But they aren't and you are." He tied the parchment to the rope again and watched the raven hop and look offended, as ravens do. He let the cold do what it always did, make him honest. He was not a king. He was not a hero. He did not want to be told he had done well. He wanted to wake each day and see men and women walking along a road in winter, their breath rising in little clouds, and know that if they fell there would be a hand extended before their faces hit the snow. The next day brought another thing because the world does not stop making work for those who choose to work. Word came from the rills. A petty band, Ironborn by the look of their boats and their ignorance of trees, had rowed up a creek and stolen not pigs or grain but people. John was already moving before the messenger had finished. He had men on the road and a boat on the river before sundown. They caught the raiders in the pinch of a mouth where a creek meets salt and cannot decide if it is brave enough to be either. The Ironborn lifted axes and curses. John lifted his sword and his men lifted theirs. There was blood. There is always blood. There were also 3 people taken back who had already learned the look of a deck from below, and would have carried that look all their lives if they had not been seen. It does not make the world a clean place. It makes it bearable. After, a girl of 12 with 2 missing teeth came and stood in front of John and scowled at him with such intensity, he had to hold back laughter for fear of disrespect. "You're the one who brings people home," she said, accusing him of it. "I am one of them," he said. "There are others. They are better at it than I am. They are kinder, and some are meaner, and you need mean ones if you want gentle ones to do their work." She considered him with all the seriousness of a judge. "Good," she said, and nodded, and ran off to kick a boy who had stolen her cap. Tormund laughed and said, "That one will be queen of something before long." Time passed. Time is a rock and a river both. The new watch held because enough men and women wanted it to. It changed because nothing we make should stay what it was when so many different hands touch it. They learned to send money south for grain when rains failed, and to send men south for justice when tattlers told tales of watchmen who took what they should not. They learned to explain themselves to the faith and the Lord's declarant and the men who taught letters to Lord's sons, and when explanation failed, to stand and let wind sand them down until the wind was tired. They learned 100 small lessons and one large one. You cannot defend anyone well if you insist on being the only defender. You must teach what you know. And so they did. They taught the women of the Flint. They taught the boys of the Frostfangs and the girls of the Fingers. They taught the Trident folk who had not been able to stay at home how to build a home here in a place that does not pretend to be easy. Some summers later, when men had begun to forget a little how suddenly winter can breathe on the back of a man's neck, John walked again to the night fort. He did not go because he needed to say words to Wood. He went because he wanted to stand in a place that had always known his name even when he did not. The gate was warm. He pressed his hand to it. Ghost pushed his nose beside it. They stood and listened to nothing together. It was a good silence, fed and watered like a garden. On his way back he stopped at a wayhouse where the sign over the door had been painted by a child who loved her work and had painted the letters too large. The table was full of men first and of women second and of children third, and a pot simmered that had bread thrown into it in hunks. A song was being sung badly by a man who did not know the words and did not care. He had found the tune and was content to ride it until it let him off. The woman who kept the house brought John stew and did not charge him, and when he tried to pay she put his coin back into his hand and shut his fingers around it like a mother correcting a child gently and efficiently. "If you will insist on buying anything," she said, "buy mittens for that boy by the door. He won't admit he needs them." John bought the mittens. He sat and ate and listened to the song and let himself think, just for one selfish, unwarlike moment, that perhaps he had come farther than he had ever expected. Sigrun came and sat across from him and did not smile. Because she had not smiled much before her daughter had been taken and had not learned the habit after. "The wood I cut this morning cut me back," she said. "I am getting old." "Everyone is," John said. "It's the quietest war we fight." She poured herself a cup and looked at him over its rim. "My daughter says your men are fools, because they teach anyone who is willing. She says the mistake the old lords made was to teach only their own boys. It made the kings good at games and the rest of us worse at living." "She is wise," John said. "She is young," Sigrun said, and rolled her eyes as if that were the same thing. "There is a difference. You've made both a little safer." He slept that night under a roof he had not built. He woke at dawn to the sound of a kettle complaining and Ghost snoring. He stepped into the yard and felt the world inhale. That is what the world does before a storm. He could smell snow in the way old wood beams talk to the air. He could smell the deep, High cold that means real work for men who wear black and walk roads with no names on maps. He tightened his cloak. He put his hand to Ghost's neck. He looked at the sky, which was as honest as it had ever been about its intentions. He thought of Sansa, head bent over parchment, counting and ordering that men might live. Of Tormund, laughing at the idea of rest. Of Sam, with his pen like a sword cutting open lies to make room for truth. Of the 2 men he had sent to the river ford who would be there now, stamping their feet and telling each other jokes they had told 100 times to keep their throats from closing. He smiled. He did not think of the thrones of men or of the things that stack power inside stone walls. He thought of the new oath and the old face in the wood and of bridges that would not be cut. Not tonight. He thought of a girl running her fingers over the stitches of her new mittens like a noblewoman over a necklace and thought, with an intimacy that surprised him, that this was what a kingdom worth defending looked like. Not an iron seat, not a jeweled crown, but a pair of homespun mittens in a place where wind will try to take the fingers of anyone who dares defy it. When the snow came at last, it came from the north and the south both, wind whipping it into a knife edge that made eyes water. The new watch went out into it as they had vowed to do, and Jon went with them as he did when he could. They found a cart sunk wheels deep and pulled it free. They found an old man dead against a fence and took him to a house that would know his name and did not ask if his coin had been good or bad. They built his pyre and spoke over it. They found a child who had gotten lost chasing something shiny and a woman who had lost her way in the same place 30 years ago and never learned the path. They found all the small work the world throws as obstacles at the feet of those who think they have only big work to do. They moved the obstacles and made a road. Toward dusk the snow veered and left them a small gift of clear air. Jon stood, the weight of it all on him and through him and not driving him into the earth, not today. Tormund stomped up beside him and made a noise that might have been meant for a word and got tired and became a sigh. "You have made a strange sort of army," he said. "Not an army," Jon said. "An agreement." "Call it what you will," Tormund said. "You've made a family that can kill and still look dinner in the eye." He clapped Jon on the back. "That is a thing. There are not many men who can do it. There are fewer who should even try." Jon watched the light go from the world with the steady nobility the sun always had no matter how men cursed or begged. He did not say anything noble. He said what a man says when he is tired and content in the way a cold man is content to have a fire in sight. "Let's go home," he said. Tormund grinned. "You'll have to tell me where that is," he said. "I forget sometimes." Jon looked at the road, which was only a lighter line in the snow. He looked at the wayhouse roof, a darker shape against the dark. He looked at Ghost, who had sat without being told and was now watching the light die as if it were a friend who had promised to meet him tomorrow. "Wherever we are expected," Jon said finally, and started walking toward the door with the 2 large letters painted above it and the smell of stew and the sound of spoons knocking on bowls like small honest bells.